I'm Steve Clemens. I direct the foreign policy programs here at the New America Foundation. I'm very, very pleased to have all of you joining us for what's a joint event of the Nixon Center here in Washington with the New America Foundation. We've got an outstanding panel to talk about a topic that has long interested me. And it's interesting that as a point of reference in American foreign policy circles, the notion of what Nixon would do, or Nixon going to China, how would that sort of mental template, intellectual template in foreign policy be applied to contemporary problems is more regularly coming to the fore. We're joined here today in the audience by Chris Elfman, chairman of the board of the Nixon Foundation, out from California. Very glad you're here joining us. And it is this approach, this disciplined, strategic approach to national security questions, which has interested and directed the foreign policy activities of the New America Foundation for a long time. But it had its roots very much when the Nixon Center opened up offices here in Washington in 1994, and we're very pleased to have with us today the president of the Nixon Center, Dimitri, who was the foreign policy advisor to President Nixon in the latter part of his life. He is the publisher of the journal National Interest, with which we so frequently partner here at the Foundation. And to his right, we have Julia Sweig, who is the Nelson and David Rockefeller Senior Fellow for Latin America Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, where she also directs the Latin America program. Julia is author of Friendly Fire, Losing Friends and Making Enemies in the Anti-American Century, also Inside the Cuban Revolution, Fidel Castro and the Urban Underground, a book which we also did a program here at New America Foundation about a few years ago. But she also was a senior advisor to just a fantastic report. I can't say enough good things about a Council on Foreign Relations report that came out a few months ago on Latin America. And the reason I say so is I have great respect for the Council on Foreign Relations, but I never expect sizzlers. And this was a sizzler because it was bold in how common sense it was and non-ideological to thinking through pragmatically problems that we have in the region, and I highly recommend it. It is linked on my blog, The Washington Note, on which this event is streaming live right now as we speak, but I really love this report by Julia Sweig. And to her right is Flint Leverett, my colleague here at the New America Foundation, who is senior fellow and director of our Geopolitics of Energy initiative. Many of you know that Flint did the sort of trifecta in government. He's a CIA guy, State Department guy, and he was one of George W. Bush's chief spear carriers on Middle East policy as senior director for the Middle East in the National Security Council. I'm getting a little flamboyant with that introduction because I want Flint to basically articulate where he stands vis-a-vis the administration at this point. But he's one of the sharpest strategic thinkers that I know, applying his mind and disciplined, unsentimental thinking to a lot of these key questions is something we should be doing a lot more of. Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, former State Department Chief of Staff and a 16-year aide to Colin Powell, will be joining us. He's on his way. He's going to sit right here. But we're here today to talk about what would Nixon do on U.S.-Cuba relations, in which direction would that sort of thinking go. And so without further ado, please let me introduce my former boss long ago here in Washington, Dimitri, who will join us at the podium and share his thoughts, and then we'll move through the program. Dimitri.
Steve, thank you very much for your very generous introduction, in particular for saying that we co-sponsor the event with you. It was your idea. You put the panel together. You have done all the work, but we're honored to be here. Now, I have to say it's rather reckless conduct on my part to come here to talk about anything involving Cuba, because my exposure to Cuba was very limited. First, I used to have an office next to this gentleman, who is a genuine expert on Cuba. But my office was in close proximity, but not quite next to yours. But I have learned a lot. Also, about 20 years ago, a little more than that, I was at a country called Angola. I was a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment, but was also writing a column for Christian Science Monitor. And I went to visit a fellow called Savimbi in his headquarters in Jamba. And they took me to see some of their military operations. And I literally could see Cuban tanks trying to cross the river. And then heavy artillery came from somewhere. And I asked where this artillery was coming from, and nobody would tell me. Finally, when I came back to Jamba, to Mr. Savimbi's camp, I was told by my South African handler, who actually brought me to Savimbi's camp, that it was the artillery. But it was not supposed to be something mentioned in a good company, because officially the South Africans were not involved. So this is the limit to my expertise in Cuba. I do know something, however, about Nixon's thinking about Cuba. And that is not terribly difficult, because he wrote about it in his last book. It was literally his last book, which was published shortly after his death. As you may remember, Nixon was, how to put it, not known as a great friend of communism, as a great admirer of Fidel Castro, and he did not particularly like when anybody would establish a Soviet military base in the close proximity of the United States. But it was long before. By 1993, 1994, when Nixon was writing his book, the Soviet Union was no more. The Cubans were no longer in Africa. They were not seriously involved, at least not in a major way, in any kind of subversion in Latin America. In Nixon's mind, Cuba was not a serious threat to US foreign policy interests. And Nixon did not become any more friendly to Fidel or to his form of government or to what that government was doing to the Cuban people. But Nixon was first and foremost a practitioner of realpolitik. He did not want the United States to be friendly with anyone who had totally different values, but he was perfectly prepared to have a normal relationship with everyone who was not a menace to America. And on that basis, he wrote that Cuba no longer presents an active threat to the peace internationally. He asked whether the interest of the world community is better served by the closed door or the open door to Cuba. He wrote, the plain fact, painful so it may be to face, is that after 35 years of Castro's rule, the hard line against him has failed to get rid of him. It is time to shift the central focus of our policies from hurting Cuba's government to helping its people. And it had some very specific operational guidance. This means we should drop the economic embargo and open the way to trade, investment, and economic interaction, while insisting that ideas and information be allowed to flow as freely as goods. That was Nixon's opinion back 15 years ago. I would be prepared to argue that Cuba did not become any more of a menace during last 15 years. Another Castro is now in charge, but still were not able to get rid of those brothers and of their regime. And there is no more evidence now than it was then that embargo of Cuba, pressure on Cuba, isolation of Cuba help either American interests or, for that matter, Cuban people. Nixon felt rather strongly about opening the doors to Cuba for a particular reason. Well, of course, he used to love Cuban cigars. But first, I have to confess that even despite the embargo, back in the 1980s, he occasionally would enjoy a Cuban cigar in his residence and would open Cuban cigars to his friends. But to be serious, he could not even smoke Cuban cigars by 1993 or any other cigars on his doctor's order, so that was hardly a motive. The motive was that Nixon was very angry with the way the United States was allowing key foreign policy decisions to be made by single-issue interest groups. He felt very strongly, as you know, that US policy in the Middle East was affected in a major way by pro-Israeli lobby, and he was quite uncomfortable with that for many, many years. As you probably know, Nixon was a very strong defender of Israel. Nixon also was, in one respect, the ultimate Cold Warrior. He could not stand the notion that a Soviet client would be allowed to prevail over an American client. Accordingly, in October 1973, when Brezhnev threatened the United States with unilateral dispatch of Soviet troops to Egypt, when the Israelis have encircled the Israeli Third Army, Nixon put American troops on alert. And he was very uncomfortable, from what I understand, about making that decision, because it coincided with him firing Mr. Cox. And of course, a major scandal. Cox was special Watergate prosecutor, and a major scandal connected with that. And Nixon knew, in his heart of hearts, that his decision to proceed with a military alert in the Middle East would inevitably be interpreted as a political gesture to distract attention from what was happening to his presidency at home. But he felt that the Soviet Union could not be allowed to prevail. The Soviet Union could not be allowed to intimidate an American ally, particularly in an important region like that. But at the same time, Nixon felt that fundamental foreign policy decisions affecting key American interests, they have to be made looking at key American interests, not under domestic pressure from any kind of a lobby. That was true as far as Israel was concerned. That was as true, very true, when he was looking at US relations with Cuba. And Nixon told me on a number of occasions that he was very irritated that a small group of swing voters in Florida, and to some extent in New Jersey, could determine American policy toward Cuba. Nixon told me that whenever they were talking about Cuba during his presidency, he could not find any serious strategic argument for a policy of total isolation of Fidel Castro. He felt that there had to be a very strong response when there were, of course, Soviet missiles on Cuba, or when he felt the Soviets wanted to introduce a submarine base to Cuba, or to do anything that would affect American interests. But he thought it was very unfortunate that the United States only had a stick and could not offer Fidel Castro any kind of a carrot. And he felt the carrot was denied to American foreign policy makers, again, not for serious strategic reasons, but because of domestic political pressures. Cuba today is not yet a major threat. And when Steve have invited me to speak at this meeting, I could not find a serious argument why we should worry about Soviet presence in Cuba. Well, now there is such an argument, because there was an announcement in Moscow that the Soviet Union, in response to American missile defenses in Europe, may consider establishing some kind of strategic presence in Cuba again, particularly for Russian strategic bombers. That statement was made by a former chief of staff of Russian Air Force. Later it was denied, but we do know that very often in Moscow, when a statement like that would not just be made by a retired military officer, but would be all over the news, including all over government-controlled TV channels, that you should not take it literally, but you should not dismiss it entirely either. It is a trial balloon. It is a veiled threat. Actually, I shouldn't say not so veiled threat. And depending upon Havana's response, and depending upon what will happen in the US-Russian relationship, Moscow may or may not act on it. Last week, Mr. Chavez was in Moscow, and they have signed fairly far-reaching agreements, particularly in the energy area. We do not quite know what happened in the military area. We do know that Chavez had a meeting with the Russian defense minister, that he had a meeting with Sergei Ivanov, deputy prime minister who supervises defense industries, but they did not make any announcements. Let's face it, Russia is no longer a superpower. Russia does not have communist global ideology. It is not looking for a confrontation with the United States. But we developed a theory in Washington which actually predates the Bush administration, but became particularly dominant during the Bush administration, that nations respond to the United States regardless of American conduct, simply because they either share or reject American values. That traditional action-reaction is not really a factor in international politics, at least as far as the United States is concerned anymore. That's not quite the case. Last week, Zalmay Khalilzad, whom Steve knows well and who is a very able US ambassador to the United Nations, was quite surprised, indeed sounded shocked, that Russia and China jointly vetoed the UN Security Council resolution introducing new sanctions against Zimbabwe. And Khalilzad said that Russian President Medvedev, just 10 days earlier, at G8 meeting in Tokyo, a kind of story in Japan, quite implied that Russia would go along with the sanctions. Well, if you look at the language of what Medvedev promised in Japan, it was short of promising to support a UN Security Council resolution. But it clearly implied that there could be some financial sanctions against Zimbabwe leaders. So what happened in between that changed the Russian position? Well, all you need to do is to look at Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice's itinerary in Europe between the Hokkaido G8 summit and between the UN Security Council vote. First, she spoke in Prague, announcing that a deal was cut on US radar facility in the Czech Republic, which is a part of future anti-missile defense, and the Russians believe that is directed against them. Then the Secretary of State went to Georgia, not Georgia, Jimmy Carter's homeland, but another Georgia, the land of Georgian strongman Mikhail Saakashvili. We're standing next to Mr. Saakashvili. The Secretary of State said that first, Russian actions against Georgia were provocative, reiterated US interest in having Georgia in NATO, and finally said that the United States would stand behind its allies and assure their security. Now, she said that in answering a specific question about Israel and Iran, but she said it in Tbilisi, standing next to Mr. Saakashvili. The reaction in Moscow was extremely strong, extremely strong. And let me end on this point. The United States does not have so many friends, and the United States is not so absolutely secure that it would be, in my view, in the American interests to go around the world and to look for additional demons. And it would not be in our interest to have a country so close to the United States, which we alienate so completely that they would be inevitably looking for other alliances and for other sponsors. That was not in the American interest when Nixon wrote this book 15 years ago. It is even less in the American interest today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dimitri. Yes, you can clap. I think that was great. Thank you so much for setting the stage. Now let me invite Julia Sweig up, and I should mention that just about 2 weeks ago, Julia made a brilliant appearance on the Colbert Show, which is also on the blog. Would you like to join us up here, Julia?
Okay. Thank you very much, Steve. Your enormously warm introduction is very, I'm very gratified by it and very happy to be here with you at New America and with you, the rest of my fellow panelists. The what would Nixon do question is a fun one, and I want to break up my discussion into two parts. One sort of a fun history. I'll share an anecdote with you, and then we'll get into the serious policy going forward. The history part is serious as well, but and I think there may be a couple of people here in the room that know this story, but not so many. 50 years ago today, almost to the day, but this month, Raul Castro released the last of a total of 50 American and Canadian hostages whom he and his rebels in the Sierra Cristal had taken hostage over the course of a few weeks the previous month in June. Some of them were enlisted men who were based at Guantanamo, which was part of his purview during the insurgency. Some of them, the Canadian and American civilians, worked at the Moa nickel mine. And he kidnapped them for he held them for more than a month, actually. And his objective was to engineer a ceasefire by the Batista Air Force, which was strafing rebel strongholds in his area of operation. He did this without the knowledge, I think, of Fidel Castro, and I think over his at least initial objection. Now, at the time, Vice President Nixon was in the early stages of planning for his presidential run. And he had befriended some people, and I'm not sure if it's Bibi Rebozo, who many of you will remember this name, that played this role, who were helping him along those lines. And Rebozo lived in Key Biscayne, you'll remember, where Nixon had started vacationing once he came to the Congress in 1946. Hold that thought. The Cuban insurgency had a lot of money to buy weapons, and of course the insurgents had fanned out all over the United States and the Caribbean and South America to get weapons. And one of the people that they had retained in order to help them bring weapons in for the urban underground and for Fidel and Raul's armed actions in the Sierra was a man named Frank Fiorini. Now, this name you will remember too because it comes up later in Nixon's own history. Fiorini became a gun runner throughout 1957 and 1958 for the insurgency, and in about early July, he returns from one of his trips to Miami, and he passes a message to the man who at the time was running the urban underground in Havana, which was intended for Raul Castro, but I don't think he ever received it. And the message was that some people who are involved in planning Nixon's presidential campaign would provide Raul with weapons and money in exchange for allowing the release of the hostages to be framed as an accomplishment of Nixon when it came time for the presidential campaign. Now, this arms for hostages deal, I don't think that Raul Castro ever learned about it, or he may have subsequently. And I'm not really sure at all, have no evidence that Nixon himself knew about it, although one doesn't know. Anyway, in any case, the hostages were released out of a series of negotiations conducted by the consul in Santiago and the vice consul, and Fiorini was later involved in plots to assassinate and overthrow Castro, and although he never succeeded in overthrowing the Cuban Revolution, he did help in destroying the Nixon presidency because, as Frank Sturgis, he was one of the Watergate burglars. Anyway, I would only raise this kind of fun question, and then I'll go on to the serious policy part, which is just counterfactually, had Raul received the message from Garcia, because Garcia, in fact, was Fiorini's underground name that the rebels used to talk about him, had he received the message from Garcia and entertained or accepted the offer, how might Nixon's meeting with Fidel in April of 1959, once Fidel was now in office leading the revolution, have been different? That's one question, and so I suppose had Nixon himself come to be president as a result of the 1960 elections, what might also have been between Cuba and the United States? Anyway, contemplate that while I go on to the serious policy stuff. The Nixon of détente, Nixon the realist, might well have endorsed the basic policy proposals in the Council on Foreign Relations Task Force with respect to Cuba, because what it proposes is very straightforward, and it is simply that we start talking to the Cuban regime. And there are two reasons, well, there are many reasons, but one fundamental feature of current policy toward Cuba is that today it's structured so that Fidel Castro and Raul Castro now have more power to alter our policy toward Havana than Washington currently does, because the rule of the land, Helms-Burton gives the lion's share of decision of authority to the Congress, having stripped it from the executive branch, meaning specifically that under the law, Cuba has to essentially commit domestic political suicide in order to gain access to our markets, access to talks, the kind of basic diplomatic and economic and commercial recognition that President Nixon spoke of in his memoir 15 years ago. We want to try to flip that around and put the onus and the power to make policy back in the hands of Washington. How to do that, to break this preposterous and counterproductive dynamic in two ways, very simple. One is to talk on many, many issues. Now, Raul Castro has said since Fidel's illness, I think 3 times, perhaps 4, I looked at his speech the other day and didn't see any reference to it, that he would be fully disposed to sit down and talk with the United States on the basis of mutual respect on a range of issues completely open-ended, not at all specified about what. We should take him up on that, and we have, of course, a number of, starting with the security dimensions of our proximity to one another, a number of issues on which we ought to be talking with Cuba, and I can discuss those in some detail later if you're interested. But before the talking part starts, or as the talking part starts, there are 2 things that the next administration can do. And the first is to take the very limited executive branch authority that it still retains and resurrect what the Bush administration has eliminated, which is 13 categories of licensed travel that allows, it's called purposeful travel, allows American citizens under the rubric of their churches, their educational institutions, lots of civil society organizations to travel to Cuba. It isn't tourism, and it largely was not under the Clinton administration conceived to be tourism or executed by Americans who traveled to Cuba as tourism, but it gives the opportunity for us to get to know one another, Cubans and Americans, to refresh our Rolodexes, to get a sense of what makes one another tick, which of course will be so important going forward. So the travel piece of it is very important. Of course, obviously, the family reunification and travel measures that have been stripped away largely since 2004 ought to be immediately reinstated, and those can be done with a stroke of a pen. It isn't necessary to have the Congress legislate that change. At the same time, of course, the next White House could easily signal to this and the next Congress that it won't exercise its veto against legislation that might come through scaling back pieces of the embargo and its sanctions, such as the travel ban and other commercial dimensions. The big headliner that we did include in that report was to repeal Helms-Burton, but of course, starting out of the block by repealing Helms-Burton might not be as easy as just beginning to disaggregate it and go piece by piece. I'm going to make just 3 more small points, and then I will wrap this up. I think Guantanamo, oddly, but not surprisingly for the reasons we all know now, has become a symbol now not just for Cuba of America's imperial designs on its actual territorial sovereignty, but globally and certainly within Latin America of so much of what's gone wrong with American foreign policy in the last several years. And Guantanamo has been an issue that the Cuban government has repeatedly, sometimes more loudly than others, attempted to put back on the bilateral agenda. This is the time, in the context of the base closure movement that we had after the end of the Cold War, but this is now the time to actually seriously sit down and figure out not only how to close the detention camps there, but how to give Guantanamo back, or certainly how to see Guantanamo, to convert Guantanamo from a symbol of wretched, negative American power to something far more positive. You might be thinking to yourselves, well, what about the politics of this? You know, what about the Cuban Americans that drove President Nixon crazy for their lock-on policy? How do we deal with that? You know, we can tie ourselves in knots to try to figure out how to triangulate an approach, and I'm sure that the next White House will to some extent. But we all know that the demographics of the Cuban American community have changed substantially, and we know that the Cuban American community is no longer a single issue nor a single party voting bloc. So I think we might be a bit surprised to see how quickly the United States could move forward with far less resistance than some might anticipate. It's quite a new era, and Fidel Castro's illness and his sidelining from power is an opportunity to bury the hatchet, both within the community and more broadly between the two countries. So I don't know if Richard Nixon would do everything that I just said, but I get to play Nixon for a moment, and I hope, he's listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Now let me invite Flint Leverett to join us, and then Colonel Wilkerson.
Contrary to every manual on public speaking I think I've ever seen, I'm going to start off by proactively making apologies for two things. One is that my expertise in Cuba can be generously characterized as somewhat less extensive than Dimitri's, and I will put that on the table up front, particularly coming right after Julius Sweig. The second thing I'll apologize for is that I'm not hanging around for the questions because I'm participating in a climate change war game today at another think tank, CNAS, and I have to get back to that. But I am very pleased to be here because I think this is a very important topic. I think it's a topic that is important not just in terms of U.S. interests in Latin America, how best to pursue those, but it also, the issue of Cuba policy raises, I think, one of the most fundamental questions that Americans need to address about their foreign policy, not just in the Western Hemisphere, but in any critical arena, the Middle East, what have you. And that question is, should American foreign policy be set on the basis of American national interests? And I realize that national interests are not necessarily self-evident. There can be, a room for very reasonable and responsible debate and discussion about just what is American national interests. There can also be a lot of debate over, once we agree on what the interests are, how best to pursue them. But will American foreign policy be set on the basis of American national interests, or will American foreign policy be set on the basis of something else, and that something else is most likely to be the agenda of some domestic interest group or constituency? I think if you look in geostrategic terms, what Dimitri might describe as a realist perspective, I think that the current U.S. policy toward Cuba, which I will define essentially as a mix of diplomatic isolation, attempts at economic pressure, and, at least on the margins, support for groups, particularly groups outside of Cuba, who want to try and change the political order in Cuba. And I think that that policy approach from a geostrategic or realist perspective is manifestly not serving American interests. If you look at it in terms of any, I think, reasonable assessment of the regional balance of power and influence in Latin America, the most interesting political dynamic in Latin America right now, it seems to me, is not really a contest between right and left in a lot of important countries in the region, but it's really a kind of contest between two different types of leftists. One type being exemplified by Brazilian President Lula, a kind of market-friendly, open to globalization sort of leftism versus a much more populist, nationalist, in some respects resistant to globalization sort of leftism that is perhaps best exemplified by Hugo Chavez and some of his, if I may call them, protégés in the region, such as Evo Morales. And I don't think that the U.S. right now is doing as well in terms of how its interests are being served. It's not doing as well in this contest between these two types of leftism as it might. And if we really wanted, in a serious way, to turn the tables on Mr. Chavez and pull an important leg out from under his strategic position in the region, it seems, as admittedly something of an amateur in Latin American international relations, it seems to me fairly obvious that if the United States could pursue a serious strategic opening, a real rapprochement with Cuba, this is a pretty serious blow to Mr. Chavez and his allies. I don't think there's anything particularly profound in that. I think it is fairly obvious balance of power sort of reasoning. But by virtue of this now decades-long policy approach to Cuba, in which we seem stuck, we are unable to respond in as effective a way as we might to whatever kind of challenge we believe Mr. Chavez represents to American interests in the Western Hemisphere. Another area in which our established Cuba policy is, in my view, not serving American interests very well is with regard to energy. Now, we all know the mantra, and there's a fair amount of truth to it, that we all live in a single integrated global market for crude oil and refined products. But the fact of the matter is that most of the world's important supply patterns for crude oil are highly regionalized. You know, the United States does not get that much of its imported oil from the Middle East. Europe does, Asia does in a big way, but the United States does not. The United States is importing most of the oil that it imports from countries in the Western Hemisphere. Canada, Mexico, Venezuela are all important suppliers for the United States. Well, as I think many of you are aware, there is a mounting body of evidence that there are significant hydrocarbon prospects in Cuba. We don't know yet how extensive those prospects are, but we do know that they are likely to be significant or very promising. The Cuban government is in active discussions with, I think at this point, virtually all of the world's leading energy companies, with, of course, the exception of those that are headquartered in the United States. And it seems to me that it makes no sense at a time when many Americans are worried about the dependence of the United States on crude oil supplies from countries that don't particularly wish the United States well, or that have some level of domestic instability which raises concerns about how secure that supply is. And I would suggest that Mr. Chavez's Venezuela probably fits into both of those categories for a lot of Americans. You know, why are we, as a matter of policy, shutting ourselves off from any participation in the monetization of Cuba's hydrocarbon reserves? And why are we taking a position where, even apart from how much we would participate, is going to make it harder for others to bring those hydrocarbons to market? I mean, if you take energy security seriously as an issue, that posture just simply makes no sense. So I am at a loss to think of a single plausible argument for how our current policy toward Cuba is serving American interests. Now, Dimitri and I think, largely share a perspective on how to define U.S. national interests. But I think we would have to recognize there would be others who would argue that our definition of national interests is too narrow, too materialist, too rooted in the mindset of realpolitik, all of which makes us feel very good about ourselves. But, you know, we realize there are people who don't share our point of view, and there would be people who would say American foreign policy can't be based solely on geostrategic interests. It must also reflect American values, and it is right as a matter of policy to try and change internal conditions in a place like Cuba, where the political system has operated for decades in a manner that offends American values, American sensibilities, international standards of human rights, etc. Okay, let's just take that perspective seriously for a couple of minutes. Okay? Historically, there have been basically two approaches in American foreign policy to trying to promote greater openness, political liberalization, economic reform in societies that we considered closed and authoritarian. Two approaches. There is the approach that we have taken to Cuba, as I described it: diplomatic isolation, efforts at economic pressure, and support for groups, particularly exile groups, that want to change the political order in Cuba. Okay? Now, we have been pursuing this policy with regard to Cuba for, it's coming up on 40 years. All right? And I would yes, thank you. I would suggest that, we have very, very little, if anything, to show for that in terms of improvements in the lives of ordinary Cubans that took place as a result of U.S. policy. I just don't think the track record is real good on Cuba. Now, one could argue, well, if we just keep doing what hasn't worked for decades, if we just keep doing it for 1 year or 3 years or 5 years or 10 years longer, it's all of a sudden going to become a whole lot more successful. I have to say the causal logic of that argument is opaque to me. Why should I believe that what has not worked for decades is all of a sudden going to work? The other place where the United States tried this approach, and I know a little bit more about this case than about Cuba, was Iraq, where we tried, from the 1990s on, and we formalized this in the Iraq Liberation Act, that by diplomatic isolation, economic pressure, support for external exile groups, we were going to overthrow Saddam's regime and bring about a much better set of circumstances in Iraq. Well, that policy didn't work either in terms of getting rid of Saddam. In the end, we had to invade the country in order to do that. And secondly, I think the fact that we stuck with this external exile, Ahmed Chalabi kind of approach to political reconstitution in Iraq, that is an important part in why we have been in such bad shape in Iraq in terms of post-conflict stabilization. I just don't think the track record for this one approach to trying to liberalize a place you want to liberalize, I don't think this more coercive approach really has a lot going for it historically. There is an alternative, and it's engagement. It is engagement both with the regime that you may not like in some ways, and also engagement with the people, with civil society, through commerce, other kinds of social interactions. You engage both with the people and with the regime. The historical track record on this is the dismantling, peaceful dismantling of the Soviet bloc and the spread of democratic regimes in much of Latin America. Compare the two, their historical records. And even if you want to say that promoting liberalization, openness, reform in Cuba should be, the top priority, or at least a very high priority for U.S. policy toward Cuba, the current policy doesn't even serve that agenda. Okay? So what does the current policy serve? And I will close by trying to answer that question by simply quoting an answer that was given to that question by someone that I admire very much, the former National Security Advisor, General Brent Scowcroft, who asked this question. My answer on Cuba is not a foreign policy question. Cuba is a domestic issue. In foreign policy, the embargo makes no sense. It doesn't do anything. It's quite clear we cannot starve Cuba to death. We learned that when the Soviets stopped subsidizing Cuba and they didn't collapse. It's a domestic issue. And so with that, I'll come back to the question with which I started. Should American foreign policy be formulated and implemented on the basis of American national interests or on the basis of something else? And as with Dimitri, I'm proud to stand with him in the corner that says clearly and unashamedly, we think American national interests ought to guide American foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Flint. Thank you very much, Flint. That's great, and give our CNAS friends our regards on the climate change war games. And now Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson, whom I should also mention co-chairs our U.S.-Cuba policy initiative here at the New America Foundation, and also had a spicy quote once on this very issue when he was working for Colin Powell. I think it was in GQ magazine, right, Larry?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll let you kind of report the quote.
Dumbest policy on the face of the earth. I'm going to go fast, right? Because we got to.
Yeah.
I just finished reading 1 Minute to Midnight, which I recommend to all of you. There's some revelations in there about the Cuban Missile Crisis that would probably shock Graham Allison, or probably have. It is a wonderful study in how screwed up our Central Intelligence Agency was, and probably will forever be, but also a real insight into the characters, Raul, Fidel, Nikita, and a host of others. I also just finished reading Dalek's book for about the third time on Nixon and Kissinger, because I teach this subject, Partners in Power, and also Margaret Macmillan's book, Nixon and Mao, The Week That Changed the World. From the first book, I think we gain further confirmation and illuminating details of what we've known for some time, not least from Henry's tomes, that when it came to the relations of nations, Nixon was no dummy, and Kissinger helped a great deal. Dalek at one point even uses the phrase co-president. From the second, we gain further confirmation and illuminating details of something else we've known for some time, that Nixon and Kissinger were geostrategic thinkers par excellence and used reality, not dreams of grandeur or world-encompassing democracy, to inform their foreign policy decisions. As an aside, it's fascinating to me as a student of national security decision-making since World War II that the Nixon-Kissinger team more or less pioneered the secretive imperial executive methods that the Bush-Cheney team would later adopt, modify, amplify, and need I say bastardize, largely due to their lack of the intellectual credentials Dick and Henry brought to the table. I'm in fact, with regard to the Bush-Cheney team, reminded of what H.L. Mencken wrote so presciently in the Baltimore Sun, I believe, in July 1926, went something like this. The larger, he's referring to our political process, the larger the mob, the harder the test. In small areas, before small electorates, a first-rate man occasionally fights his way through, carrying even the mob with him, largely by the force of his personality. But when the field is nationwide, and the fight must be waged chiefly, and think of TV now, at second and third hand, and the force of personality cannot so readily make itself felt, then all the odds are on the man who is intrinsically the most devious and mediocre, the man who can most adeptly disperse the notion that his mind is a virtual vacuum. The presidency tends, therefore, year by year to go to such men. As democracy is perfected, the office represents more and more closely the inner soul of the people. We move toward a lofty ideal. On some great and glorious day, the plain folks of the land will reach their heart's desire, and the White House will be adorned by a downright moron. This is why I think the major issue before us with regard to a change in U.S. Cuba policy is twofold. One, we can't have a moron in the White House, and we're not going to, in my view. 2 times in a row would probably be bankrupting. And second, it's not on anyone's attention. It's not in anyone's attention. I have to disagree with Dimitri because, respectfully, because I've heard George Shultz, I've heard Colin Powell, I've heard indeed mostly every Republican I know of note say our Cuba policy is dumber than mud, or words to that effect. And the fact that Nixon said it in 93 or 94 or whatever is not as President of the United States. So it becomes a very different thing. I watched my boss, Colin Powell, become co-chairman and really the chairman of the U.S. Cuba Commission, and essentially had to sit in a congressional hearing and listen to a more right-wing Cuban American, if you will, regale me or criticize me for having said that Powell said something that he didn't say because Powell said what he said in public, and he did. He did. He's the one responsible for these travel restrictions. He's the one who signed the deal. He's the one who didn't have time to deal with North Korea, China, Russia, the ABM Treaty, Iraq, Afghanistan, 9/11, and a host of other things on his agenda. And so he sold out Cuba, as every president has since Castro took over, for domestic interests, as Flint pointed out, and for power interests, that is to say, staying in power. Money interests, that is to say, getting the money into their political action committees from Dade County and other Cuban Americans in this country. So that's what's driven Cuba policy, but more than anything else, I think it's just not on anybody's priority list. How do you get it there? How do you make Senator Obama, who is probably the more receptive to this issue, or Senator McCain, understand that this is an issue that should be dealt with. I think it's all in what Flint said, in what Dimitri said, and what Julia said, though I'd be a little more aggressive than just trying to roll back the travel restrictions. And that is that we need, for the first time since FDR and his good neighbor policy, a substantive, real-life, actionable policy towards Latin America, or towards the Western Hemisphere, because our Canadian friends think we're nuts too. And the best way to leave that policy is a complete and thoroughgoing rapprochement with Cuba. Thanks.
Larry, thank you very much. I do want to open the floor in the time we have left. Let me just be upfront about a couple of things. One of the reasons I feel like this program is so important is if we could, there are two people I know who channel Richard Nixon. One is Dimitri and the other is John Taylor, who's director of the Nixon Library Foundation. And I remember sitting with Dimitri Symes when we saw John Taylor do his tribute to Richard Nixon one time, and I think Dimitri told me that he could see Nixon be channeled, because it would be useful to have somebody every once in a while to sit down with a Barack Obama or a John McCain and sort of sort out things. I mean, certainly time and factors change, but when I look at where we are today, I feel that this is a discontinuous moment in history when a lot of relationships and situations need to be rethought. And I asked Flint Leverett here because he participated and was on the front line of Iran's normalization proposal in the spring of 2003 that the United States failed to attend to, failed to take action on. And that was, I think, one of the most significant lost moments given the history that's unfolded since and could still unfold with Iran. And I feel like we're on the verge of that again with Cuba, where obviously we're at a pivot point in the history of Cuba, change and transition of leadership. And it doesn't mean that everything is rosy or the problems are solved, but again, I don't see any significant recognition of that by the U.S. government, and you wonder, will we have a replay again where trends move in different direction? What is interesting is, when you look at the choices that Cuba is making, you see the growth rates that they've achieved. You look at the fact that Venezuela is the biggest patron now of the Cuban economy, but China is number 2. But you go down to Cuba, which I have done, and you talk to Cuban people, and with all due respect, because I know there's some Cuban government people in the room, but all due respect, there's not a lot of love for Hugo Chavez among the Cuban public. And what's interesting is how easy, what low-hanging fruit, to some degree, a shift in America's stance towards Cuba could do, and what it could generate by will of a real change in the roadmap. I think it's important. But one of the reasons why the Cold War got colder in Cuba over the last decade, the only place on earth in which the Cold War got colder, a Cold War that was supposed to be over, is that it is 11 million people and not 1 billion. And that allows you to do things that you wouldn't otherwise do. And I think one of the reasons why we're having this program is essentially to open up the debate. And there's more to the debate than this panel, and I recognize that. But to some degree, there have been a lot of missing participants in that. So that should. But let me make this a little bit more bipartisan. There is this cute vignette that Harry Truman, not Nixon, but Harry Truman shared, which I'd like to do. He says that he told an interview Merle Miller about 8 years after he had left office, but he did reflect on what would have happened if Castro had come into power during his time. He says, "Now, when Castro came into power, if I had been president, I'd have picked up the phone and called him direct in Havana. I wouldn't have gone through protocol or anything like that." Sounds like you. "I'd have called him up and I'd have said, 'Fidel, this is Harry Truman in Washington, and I'd like to have you come up here and have a little talk.' He'd have come to the White House, and I'd have said, 'Fidel, it looks to me like you've had a pretty good revolution down there, and it's been a long time coming. Now you're going to need help, and there are only 2 places you can get it. One's right here, and the others, well, you know where the other place is. Now you just tell me what you need, and I'll see to it that you get it.'" My point is, maybe that would have been the wrong call for Harry Truman to make, but it certainly does elevate the fundamental question about strategic choices and costs and benefits and a disciplined thinking to what's going on, and that's what we're trying to achieve today. So without that sort of ending post-amble, let me open the floor to questions and comments. Yes?
I'd like someone to address this issue of the dynamic of the Cuban-American community in Florida,
Right.
having gone through a generational change, because that seems to me will be critical, and we're going to see this fall with this election just how much that changed, that sort of dynamic has changed. But I mean, is there really a sense that an opening to Cuba would be would gain some support in that critical community, or, because you don't see it by their elected officials.
Right. Before I ask Julia Sweig to comment on that, because she's been on the edge of a lot of the new polling that has come out on generational change, but more importantly, not just the younger generation, which is easy and you see the numbers, it's the elders. The elders of people involved in the board, the general counsel, the former executive director of the Cuban American National Foundation, one of whom is actually running in a House seat against one of the incumbent Diaz-Balart brothers in Congress. So, Julia, your thoughts on generational change and what's happening in the Cuban American community?
I think it would be probably a little bit too optimistic to simply say, well, the generations have changed, Fidel's going to go, and Washington can just do this rapprochement with no political backlash, no risk of losing money and votes in different from those constituencies. That would be too enthusiastic. Having said that, what the polling shows cross-generationally, and there's a couple people in the room that can chime in if I get some of this wrong, is recognition in the majority of the Cuban American community that the current policy has failed, support for not only family travel, but travel broadly by all Americans, support clearly for remittances, and support for humanitarian initiatives that would bring the Cuban and the American people closer together. Now, if you go back to the Elian Gonzalez episode, that which came 3 years after the death of Jorge Mascanosa, the founder of the Cuban American National Foundation, those two data points really mark the shift where, as Steve said, you get a movement away from the traditional hardline by the older first-generation Cuban-American migrant, and also the waves that came in the 1980s and then in the 1990s. So the hardline has split. There is no one monolithic unified voice. We do have a challenge not only of the seat that Joe Garcia is challenging, but 3 seats held by Republicans being challenged by Democrats in South Florida. And we also have, and this will be critical, voter registration drives among Cuban Americans who did not vote. In 2000 and 2004, the voter registration drives among that community was pretty low. It's now much more aggressive. So I think we're going to have a lot more data after 2000 and after these elections to see exactly how far the Cuban American community is willing to go. And I do think certainly that as I said before, age alone is really changing this dynamic, and the progress probably will be even more evident in 2010 and 2012.
What's interesting on the political dimensions that I can just add is Barack Obama's position on Cuba pretty much matches what the sort of general, the Cuban American travel, remittances, and humanitarian issues. What's interesting about Barack Obama is that he does not go back to what the status quo was from 2001 to 2004 under this Bush administration, particularly in the non-tourist people-to-people travel. It's one of the things I've been a bit critical, applaud part of this step, but a bit critical that there's somehow a triangulation in the community that may be politically smart, but I find from a perspective of wanting to see the bigger leaps is not there. But just for those who follow the tea leaves and nuances. Yes, sir. And if you'll identify yourself too, I should have asked you from the Congressional Quarterly, and I'm going to briefly repeat so that our folks on the internet can hear.
My name's Andy Wright. I'm with the House National Security Oversight Subcommittee.
Terrific.
And, my question is about this label of being terrorist sponsor.
Right.
And I was wondering if that seems to be sort of a significant impediment given our current posture around the world. And I'm having a hard time getting a straight answer from the State Department about what is informing
Right.
designation, and I was wondering if the panel could talk about that.
Sure, they're running in circles. The question was, for anyone who'd like to respond, was about the designation of Cuba on the state sponsors of terror list, the list from which North Korea is about to be removed at the president's request. Larry? Dimitri? Yeah.
I'll take a shot at it. When I was in Havana with Steve, we had a meeting with some people from the embassy. the most, I guess we would say.
Well, from our America intersection.
Right,
yeah.
intersection, yeah. The most meaningful things that I heard from the lips of a person whom I would have special respect for, a military officer, was that the best cooperation in the Caribbean, better than even Mexico, came from the Cubans on counterterrorism, on counter-narcotics, and on navigation and maritime operations in the area in general. If there was any objection to what was happening, it was that the United States often did not reciprocate. That in fact, if some untoward element were headed for our waters or were intercepted by Cuban intelligence, they would let us know, they would let us know the details, and we would be able to, through the Coast Guard and the military team that we have working down there, apprehend or whatever. We wouldn't do the same thing back for them. And our excuse was that their police force would violate the human rights and other things. This was almost risible, especially in light of Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo and so forth. My military contacts tell me that the least threat in terms of terrorism, drugs, and other things that might come by sea, smuggled or whatever, humans being one, the Cubans are the most cooperative and the least responsible for those activities.
Any other comment? I mean, I should add, Bruce Blair of the Center for Defense Information is a good source, I would say, on the liberal part of the spectrum, but nonetheless looked at it, was very involved because the one that gave headlines to this exact question when he was Undersecretary for International Security and Arms Control was John Bolton. When Ambassador Bolton was in that role at State Department, he accused Cuba of being engaged in biowarfare activities, etc. Much of that since then has been detangle. And I think, again, I didn't go inspect VATs and, weapons houses, but it does seem from a lot of structural reasons, most of those people, even on the conservative viewpoint that would come loaded, if you will, with some baggage, tell me that the best they can tell that in the late 80s and 90s, the DNA of Cuban engagement around the world completely changed from one of exporting revolution, weapon systems, etc., to exporting doctors. And while they may be putting doctors in fields that may not want to go, but nonetheless, the direction has changed. So I think the State Department is going to continue to have a hard time answering your questions. Yes, sir, right here.
Larry Luxner, editor of Cuba News. The question is for all of you, and I'd like to know, given Nixon's fondness for real politics, why did President Nixon not establish a U.S. intersection in Havana during his presidency, something that happened, I believe, in 1977, 3 years after he resigned?
Is anyone prepared to answer that? The real expert on that would be Peter Kornblum, but...
Well, Wade Smith probably would also be an expert on that.
Oh. No? You don't want to comment?
No, I don't.
Or you don't know?
I'll take a shot.
Yeah. Well, I think it's important. Let me just ask about Peter Kornblum. Peter will be speaking for. Yeah. No, we're going to be on September 24th having a major conference on that day in Washington, which would be a very large-scale conference on some of these subjects. And Peter wanted to be here today, but I've asked him because he's writing and has helped surface the history.
Bill is here.
Oh, okay.
And he's
the
the
partner is
co-author.
okay. Excellent. Well, I apologize.
Peter and I are writing that book together.
Yes.
Fact.
Tell us about the book real
Well,
quickly, because I think it comes to this, and also a really fascinating array of secret negotiations between various presidential administrations in Cuba
Well,
that
that's
are
the
not well
essence
known.
of it. It's a history of secret diplomacy between the United States and Cuba since the triumph of the revolution in 1959. And the striking thing is that every president, until the current one, actually had negotiations with the Cubans about one set of issues or another, and Richard Nixon was no exception. In fact, Nixon, through his Assistant Secretary of State and through, first Eagleburger and then with the transition to the Ford administration with Bill Rogers, was talking with the Cubans secretly. There was a series of meetings in Washington and New York between U.S. diplomats and Cubans who were at that time posted at the United Nations. And they were moving towards an agenda for negotiations to normalize relations. So, in fact, that was Nixon's objective, that was Kissinger's objective, and what derailed it was the Civil War in Angola. When the Cubans sent troops to Angola, it became politically impossible at that point for President Ford, facing a challenge from Ronald Reagan in the Republican primaries, to continue with that process of normalizing relations.
That's great. And so we'll leave it at that, because there's a much more detailed knowledge. But on September 24th, we hope to have you and Peter back for that conference. Not sure he's shown you. And I have all these clips that my staff has found on various things. I'm going to hand them to you because it sounds like they'd be good for your article. Other questions? Yes, ma'am.
Yes, I'm during the stage. Actually, I was born and raised in Cuba under the revolution. And I guess I would be a witness to what you just said. That I think that my family is very much anti-communist, but I really socialist that it hasn't worked. And if Nixon had gone through, I mean, there's no Soviet Union at this point, there's China is a capitalist country. And I really believe that Nixon had gone through, had been able to normalize relations, that at this point probably Fidel could not have stayed in power as long as he did, because opening up relations would have really pretty much imploded the system. So I think this is long overdue. I think that people have suffered enough. And I really thank all of you.
Thank you.
for pushing this
We should
forward.
get the Beyond Peace Amazon link back on so that we can give this a second life in terms of what Nixon would do. But yes.
I just want to respond to your comment and just make a general comment which has to do with the question of, well, will a full-blown policy of rapprochement significantly alter the government, its ideology, its internal policies within Cuba? And I think the answer to that is no. And I think we ought to also be quite unsentimental in recognizing that, of course, the Pope's formulation that it's time for Cuba to open the world to the world and the world to open to Cuba is absolutely relevant. But we shouldn't assume that after 50 years, a government and a set of institutions and a society that really does have roots and legitimacy is simply going to unzip one outfit and put on another one and reinvent itself as a liberal democracy simply because the United States opens up. And so I would just say that it may well have been the case that had Truman been in office or had in the very early years of the revolution, there have been many decisions made differently than were made both in Havana and Washington. There might be quite a different political character in Havana today, but I think that we ought to be a bit cautious about our exuberance and expectations going forward about the impact of our changes, at least in the short to medium term.
Dimitri?
Well, I completely agree with Julia that we should not expect too much. But I want to follow up on what Flint Leverett said about being realists and putting American interests first. But the other side of the coin for me is that you don't do damage. You try to avoid doing harm to real people. And what interests me in the position of so many of our moralists, including on the issue of Cuba, is how indifferent they are to the very real suffering of millions of those very people we supposedly want to help. For 50 years, these people are cut off as a result of American policy from the rest of the world and certainly from the United States. Now, Mr. Castro made his contribution to this process, to put it mildly. And there was a time when this policy could be justified, both on strategic grounds and because there was at least a minimally reasonable expectation that we could affect a real regime change in Cuba. Why we are continuing doing it now? How we as moral people can justify this policy of isolation, which is inflicting suffering on real people. If you would not be prepared to inflict additional suffering on people in the name of realpolitik, is it any better to do it in the name of democracy promotion?
We're pretty much at the end of our program. I want to thank everyone for coming, but before I do, I thought about this question because I agree with Julia that sometimes the hope, if you will, behind those that would like to liberalize or see a different course in U.S.-Cuba relations, I was hoping to sort of bring this to another level. But if I had had a neoconservative representative on this board, let me mention two. One of them, and I think I'm being slightly unfair to, and I want to be careful because I like him very much, but James Glassman, who's the new Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, wrote an article in 2000 called "No Embargo, No Castro." Another member of the American Enterprise Institute staff some years ago, again a friend, I acknowledge he's a friend, Radek Sikorski, who was then running the New Atlantic Initiative and is now Poland's foreign minister. And he's asked me not to sort of set him up, but I said I can, mention his article. His article, written some years ago about Cuba and changing the game, if you will, was promoting a liberal direction, promoting engagement, promoting commerce, etc., because of his own view that that was the right way to get to a path that Julia may not think is possible, but nonetheless, you have two leading neoconservative voices out there who've both been on the side of engagement, which is really raising the question of who is keeping this from moving forward. And I think that will be the subject of our big conference on September 24th, and I hope you'll all join it. I want to recognize the director of our Cuba policy program, Patrick Doherty, up here in the front. I want to thank everybody for joining us, particularly the people online. Thank you. Oh, excuse me. I didn't see my other partner here, Tim Golden. For those of you who know Tim Golden, I was looking for you, Tim, is a senior fellow here at the New America Foundation, now writing long-covered U.S.-Cuba policy issues for the New York Times. And he really deserves. I didn't see your hand up because I'm sort of blinded up here by our lights, but if you want to make any comment, otherwise we'll use you as a resource in other functions. But would you like to make a quick comment, Tim?
I was just going to ask Julia, apropos what you were wrapping up with, if you had any sense of the extent to which the power of Cuban political contributions seems to be changing in either in a quantifiable way or in the minds of the Obama and McCain campaigns to the extent.
So the question is, do you sense that there's any change in the level amount of Cuban American political contributions to the presidential campaigns?
Well,
the impact.
There's two data points which show something very interesting, but I don't know, I can't answer how the Obama campaign is looking at the campaign money, but the Cuban American National Foundation's principal PAC, the Free Cuba PAC, has distributed money all over the Congress, especially, as you know, to new members of Congress in both parties. But the people behind the PAC are much more now conservative in terms of policy, opposing even family travel, than the Cuban American National Foundation, which originally created that PAC. So I think there's some disarray, that reflects some of the disarray. And certainly the Obama campaign's willingness to go to the Cuban American National Foundations and make a speech that got some applause and some support, but would not be universally embraced, shows a little bit of independence vis-a-vis the traditional cautiousness on Florida voting and money. Sorry, there was one other piece of that I was going to contribute, but I've just blanked it. Tim, I'll call you when I remember the second half of it. I apologize.
Thank you. I want to recognize Tim. He came down from New York for this. So I want to thank the Nixon Center, all of you for joining us. Thank the folks online, and we'll be back in September. So thank you, Julia. Thank you, Dimitri. Thank you, Larry.